My daughter-in-law smiled at me across the birthday cake, while my son's hand trembled against my arm, 4 sharp tugs on my sleeve that meant one thing and one thing only. Get me out, Dad, before she destroys everything. I am Hank Beaumont, 63 years old, and I spent 28 years as South Carolina's chief fire marshal, investigating arson for profit. I thought I retired from chasing monsters who hide behind beautiful facades. But standing in the garden of our Charleston home, watching Margot pour champagne for our wealthiest neighbors, I realized the most dangerous fire I'd ever face was already lit inside my own bloodline. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen. Before we go any further, I'd love for you to drop a quick comment and tell me where you are watching from right now. Certain details have been adjusted for storytelling and educational purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. The moment my son Davis tugged my jacket sleeve for the first time that afternoon, I did not look at his face. I looked at my watch, 3:17, marking the exact second my retirement ended, and my instincts seized the wheel. The May sunlight draped across the garden like warm honey, filtering through a live oak so old its limbs wore curtains of Spanish moss that swayed in the salt-tinged breeze off the harbor. Our house sits on Lagar Street in Charleston's historic district, a 200-year-old structure, with wide piazzas and heart pine floors that have witnessed 6 generations of Beaumont stubbornness. My granddaughter Elise was turning 2. Strings of paper lanterns swayed between magnolia branches, their petals fat and white as dinner plates, releasing a perfume so thick it competed with the smoke rolling off my low-country boil station near the carriage house. Corn, shrimp, andouille sausage, red potatoes, all tumbling in a pot big enough to bathe a Labrador. About 40 guests filled the yard. A cross-section of King Street neighbors, Davis's colleagues from the insurance firm, and the ever-expanding orbit of Margot's social network. I was nursing a glass of sweet tea, spiked with just enough bourbon to be sociable when I felt the first pressure on my bicep. It was not a casual touch. It was a coded transmission. A rhythmic squeeze and release that bypassed my conscious mind and went straight to the part of my brain, forged by 3 decades of walking through the ashes of other people's lives. You need to understand why that signal carries the weight of a loaded weapon in this family. When Davis was 12, he endured 2 semesters of relentless cruelty at Porter Gaud Middle School. The boys discovered what his father did for a living and christened him the arsonist's boy, a nickname that followed him through hallways like a shadow made of gasoline. To save him without making a scene, I invented a silent code. 4 tugs on the sleeve. I need you to get me out, and I need you now. We had not used it since his sophomore year of college, 15 years ago. Yet here it was, resurfacing like a flare shot from a sinking vessel in broad daylight. I let my gaze drift across the party, with the practiced ease of a man who once cataloged crime scenes for a living. The laughter was genuine, the children were chaos in Sunday clothes, and the lanterns bobbed like little moons. Everything was beautiful. Everything was wrong. You spend 28 years reading the story fire leaves behind, and you develop a sense for the thermal signature of a lie. I could feel heat radiating from the center of this party, and it was not coming from the boil pot. Margot was holding court near the garden gate beneath a canopy of crepe myrtle blossoms, the color of raw salmon. 32 years old, immaculately composed, with posture that suggested either ballet training or a lifetime of performing for an audience. In her left hand she held a glass of Sancerre that caught the light like liquid gold. In her right, a glossy pamphlet she was presenting to Gerald Pemberton and his wife Lorraine with the authority of a museum curator unveiling a masterpiece. Gerald owned half the commercial real estate on Upper King Street and had the trusting face of a man who believed the world was fundamentally decent. Standing behind them was Richard Hargrove, a retired surgeon whose estate plan was the quiet envy of every dinner party on the peninsula. Margot had positioned herself at the precise intersection of their trust and their wealth. I moved closer, lifting a deviled egg from a passing tray to disguise the maneuver, and heard it. Margot's voice, smooth as poured cream, describing the Heritage Art Preservation Fund. She spoke of fractional ownership in historically significant properties. tax-advantaged cultural reinvestment, and a limited intake window closing before the summer solstice. The phrases were beautiful. To my trained ear, they were also the verbal equivalent of an accelerant, frictionless heritage asset. The term detonated inside my skull, like a flashbang in a dark hallway. I had encountered that exact phrase 7 years ago, buried in the prospectus of a fraudulent conservation easement scheme in Beaufort County that stripped 12 families of their savings before the operators vanished into a maze of shell corporations. The language was the same. The melody was the same. Only the singer had changed. Davis tugged my sleeve a second time. I felt the tremor in his grip now, a vibration that traveled through the linen and settled into my own pulse. I watched Margot pause for exactly 1.5 seconds after Gerald asked about projected returns, a calculated beat of silence designed to convey authority, before quoting 22% annual yield. In my experience, the only investment that returns 22% is the one that returns nothing at all. My wife Lucille appeared at my elbow, quiet and deliberate as a librarian reshelving a misplaced book. 34 years of marriage. A woman who once managed the entire Charleston County library system with a patience that made saints look restless. She placed a plate of shrimp beside me and leaned close enough that I could smell the lavender soap on her skin. Margot left her phone face down on the snack table, Lucille murmured, barely audible above a child's shriek. I moved it before the lemonade knocked it over. The screen was active. A voice recording application had been running for 47 minutes. She met my eyes with a look I had seen exactly twice in our marriage, both times preceding events that changed everything. She is not joining this family, Hank. She is documenting it. The copper tang of adrenaline flooded my mouth, that old familiar taste I had not experienced since the last time I stood over the remains of a building someone loved and someone else had burned for the insurance money. Davis tugged my sleeve a third time, and I could feel his pulse through the fabric, rapid and shallow. The heartbeat of a man standing on the edge of something he could not name. Margot caught my gaze across the garden and did not flinch. She tilted her head with a smile as bright and hard as porcelain and extended her hand, inviting me into the circle. The gesture was flawless. The warmth was manufactured, and somewhere beneath the magnolia perfume and the children's laughter and the distant chime of St. Michael's bells, I smelled it. Not the shrimp, not the sausage, not the salt marsh on the evening breeze. Smoke. I accepted her invitation the way I once accepted entry into a building I suspected was rigged to blow. With a calm face, steady hands, and every nerve ending screaming at full volume, Margot made room for me in the circle with the fluid grace of a hostess who had rehearsed this exact choreography 100 times. Up close, her performance was even more impressive and infinitely more disturbing. She introduced me to the group not as her father-in-law but as a distinguished public servant, a man who had protected South Carolina's historical treasures from fire for nearly 3 decades. She was using my own biography as a credential for her pitch, wrapping her fraud in my reputation like a counterfeiter wrapping lead in gold leaf. Gerald Pemberton shook my hand with the grip of a man who had already decided to trust whatever came next. Lorraine smiled at me as though my presence had just validated everything Margot had been saying. Richard Hargrove nodded with the quiet approval of a surgeon who believed he was being consulted rather than operated on. I watched Margot slide the glossy pamphlet toward Gerald, her manicured fingernail tapping a chart that showed returns climbing at an angle that defied both gravity and mathematics. She leaned in and whispered something about a private allocation reserved for families who understood the value of legacy. How many times in my career had I stood in the charred skeleton of a home and traced the point of origin back to a single match, a single decision, a single moment of misplaced trust. The fire always starts small, a signature on a document you did not read, a handshake with someone whose smile felt just a little too warm. I excused myself from the circle with a compliment about the Sancerre that I did not mean and a promise to review the prospectus that I absolutely intended to keep. Davis was waiting for me near the drink table, his face angled away from the party, as though studying the roses climbing the wrought iron fence. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath the skin. Before I could speak, his hand found my sleeve for the fourth time. The pull was sharp, rhythmic, and desperate. A transmission that bypassed language and went straight to the marrow of my bones. "Don't look back, Dad," he muttered, already steering me toward the weathered cedar fence at the rear of the property. "Just walk with me." We moved through the party like two men, navigating a minefield, dressed as a garden social. The smell of mulch and damp cedar thickened as we left the laughter behind. And by the time we reached the shadow of the tall laurel hedge at the back corner, the party sounds had faded to a distant hum. The sprinklers hissed softly against the brick pathway, a rhythmic pulse that matched the drumming in my chest. I stopped and turned to face him. My voice dropped into that low-level frequency I used when a fire scene perimeter had been breached and lives were on the line. "I felt it, Davis. All four. I am here. Tell me." He swallowed hard. His pupils were dilated so wide they had nearly swallowed the blue of his irises, the same blue his mother gave him, the same blue that used to look up at me from a hospital bassinet 29 years ago when the world was simple and fathers could fix anything. "She already moved a check, Dad." The words tumbled out in a breathless rush, as though he had been holding them underwater and they were finally breaking the surface. "A pre-allocation transfer from our joint account." She did not wait for my signature. She just took it. The air in my lungs turned to cold lead. My mind, usually a fortress of disciplined analysis, felt the static of the party fade into a singular piercing frequency. I watched a bead of sweat trace a line down my son's temple and disappear into the collar of his shirt. How many fathers spend a lifetime building a fireproof wall around their family, only to discover that the arsonist was already inside the house, sleeping in the bedroom next to the nursery? "It gets worse," Davis continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that competed with the hiss of the sprinklers. "She has been using my professional license. She has been signing my name on property appraisal reports for buildings I have never inspected, homes I have never set foot in. If the state board finds out, I lose everything. My license, my career, my credibility in a custody fight." I felt the ground shift beneath me, a seismic recalibration of everything I thought I understood about my son's marriage. Margot had not just married into our family, she had requisitioned my son's professional identity as a tool. "And Elise," he said, his voice cracking on his daughter's name. "She has been coaching her, teaching a 2-year-old to repeat phrases about the Heritage Fund whenever she is around you and Mom. She is using the baby to soften you up, Dad, to make you trust the pitch when it comes." The metallic taste of adrenaline surged through my mouth again, sharper now, carrying the unmistakable bitterness of a betrayal that went beyond money. My granddaughter's innocent babbling had been weaponized into a sales script. I looked back toward the house and saw Margot's silhouette through the sliding glass door. She was refilling her Sancerre with the unhurried confidence of a woman who believed every piece on the board was exactly where she had placed it. "There is one more thing." Davis's hand finally dropped from my arm. He stared at the ground, his shoulders curving inward, as though bracing for a blow he had already taken. "She found the dashcam footage from my accident in college. The DUI. She told me if I do not sign over the retirement funds, she will send the footage to my firm and file an emergency petition with child services." He looked up at me, and for one terrible second, I did not see a 29-year-old man. I saw that 12-year-old boy cornered in the hallway, begging me with his eyes to make it stop. "She said, I would lose Elise, Dad. She said, I would lose everything." The warmth of the May afternoon suddenly felt like the heat from an interrogation lamp. Somewhere behind us, a child screamed with delight, and a champagne cork popped with the sharp crack of a starter pistol. I adjusted my posture, feeling the old authoritative weight return to my shoulders as I locked eyes with the silhouette of the woman my son had married. She was not waiting for permission anymore. She was not asking for trust. She was executing a plan that had been in motion long before the first candle was lit on that birthday cake. I reached out and gripped my son's shoulder, feeling the tremor beneath my palm. "She did not find that footage, Davis," I said, my voice carrying the cold, steady certainty of a man who has testified in 100 courtrooms. Nobody stumbles onto sealed juvenile records and dashcam archives by accident. She manufactured a cage for you. She fed your shame to keep you on a short leash. Davis stared at me, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. A flicker of the fire I had spent his whole life trying to protect. I was not just a father-in-law at a birthday party anymore. I was a retired fire marshal who had just identified the point of origin, and the woman pouring Sancerre in my living room was the accelerant. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a crime. A heavy, hollow ringing that only those who have walked through the aftermath of deliberate destruction truly recognize. As the last guest's taillights disappeared down Lagar Street and the garden gate clicked shut with a metallic finality, that silence settled over the Beaumont house like a funeral shroud. The paper lanterns still swayed in the evening breeze, but their glow had shifted from festive to funereal, casting long shadows across the lawn where 40 people had been laughing an hour ago. Margot and Davis had left together, his face a mask of manufactured composure that did not fool me for a second. She had her arm looped through his as they walked to the car, a gesture that looked affectionate from a distance, but which I recognized as a handler guiding an asset. Elise was asleep on Margot's shoulder, her tiny fist curled around the collar of her mother's linen blouse. The sight of my granddaughter's fingers gripping that fabric sent a pain through my chest that had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with the realization that innocence was being used as camouflage. I stood in the kitchen, the smell of leftover birthday cake mingling with the sterile scent of dish soap as the dishwasher began its rhythmic hum. Lucille was already moving through the cleanup with the quiet efficiency of a woman who processes anxiety through order. She did not ask me what Davis had said near the fence. She did not need to. 34 years of marriage to a fire investigator teaches you to read the smoke before someone names the flame. "Hank," she said, her voice low and steady as she stacked the remaining plates. "You saw it too, did you not?" That look in her eyes when Lorraine Pemberton mentioned their trust fund. It was not interest. It was inventory. I nodded, the weight of my linen shirt feeling like chainmail. He used the signal. "Lucille. All 4 tugs. He is terrified. He told me she has already initiated a transfer from their joint account without his consent. She has been forging his signature on appraisal documents and using Elise as a prop to make the pitch feel personal." Lucille stopped moving. A plate hung suspended in her hand, like a clock that had forgotten how to tick. "She told me something else while we were clearing the snack table this afternoon," she said, setting the plate down with a deliberate care that told me the next words were going to draw blood. I found that recording application on her phone, but it was not the only thing running. There was a second application underneath it, a remote access tool connected to our home network. "She has been inside our system, Hank. Not just listening, browsing. Marriage is a partnership built on the assumption that certain doors remain closed to outsiders. When that assumption is weaponized, when the person sleeping in your guest room is quietly copying the keys to every lock in your life, trust does not just break, it incinerates." We moved through the rest of the cleanup in a shared protective silence, our hands performing the mechanical rituals of domesticity while our minds ran parallel investigations. By midnight, the house was dark, but sleep was a ghost I could not catch. The sound of the rain against the glass started as a light tapping and grew into a steady, mournful rhythm that matched the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Lucille's breathing settle into the slow cadence of someone who had chosen to store her fear in a locked compartment until morning. At 11:47, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. The sudden buzz made my skin prickle in the dark. It was a text from Davis. "I cannot wait until the weekend. I am coming over at 7. Please do not tell Margot." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the glass. Whatever she started, "Davis, we are ending it tomorrow," I replied. Then I did something I had not done since the night before my retirement ceremony. I got out of bed, pulled on my robe, and walked down the hall to my study. The room smelled of old paper and the cold metal desk I had used for 3 decades of casework. Framed commendation letters lined the walls like headstones, marking the graves of solved cases. The blue light of my phone screen felt like a surgical blade in the darkness as I sat down and logged into my home security interface. I needed to see if the perimeter of my digital life was as compromised as my son's. My fingers moved with a muscle memory I had not exercised in years, scrolling through the remote access logs on the household network. What I found turned my blood to black ice. There were dozens of unauthorized entries spanning the previous 3 weeks. Someone had been logging into my personal office computer using Davis's network credentials. And the timestamps told a damning story. 2:14 in the morning, 3:07, unforty-through, all occurring during hours when I knew my son was asleep because I had spoken to him on the phone at those exact times. Margot had not just been raiding his savings account. She had been using his digital identity as a skeleton key to mine my own files, my investigation archives, my private financial records, my insurance policies, and the security protocols for the physical safe concealed behind the first edition Hemingway on my study shelf. She knew where I kept the collection of antique maritime charts that represented 40 years of careful acquisition and a significant portion of my retirement hedge. She knew the login credentials for my pension portal. She knew the names of my banking contacts. I stared at the access log, my pulse hammering against my throat like a fist on a locked door. The woman who called me dad and brought pecan pie to Sunday dinner had been sitting in my guest room at 3 in the morning, methodically cataloging the contents of my life while I slept 20 feet away. The betrayal was no longer just financial. It was territorial. The predator had not been circling the perimeter. She had already breached the vault. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the rain assault the windows and the old house creak around me like a ship in a storm. Somewhere in this city, Margot was sleeping in my son's bed, her phone still warm from the reconnaissance she had been running against the man who had welcomed her into his family with open arms and a set of house keys. How do you protect a fortress when the enemy already has the blueprints? You do not reinforce the walls. You change the game entirely. And at 7 tomorrow morning, my son was walking through that door, expecting me to know exactly how. I was on my 3rd cup of black coffee when the headlights of Davis's truck swept across the kitchen wall at 6:53. Not the steady approach of a man coming home, but the jerky, frantic path of someone who had spent the night outrunning his own thoughts. The discovery from the night before, that Margot had been hollowing out my digital privacy while I slept, had left a bitter, metallic residue that no amount of caffeine could dissolve. I opened the back door before he reached the porch. The gray Charleston dawn was breaking through a relentless cold rain that turned the garden into a watercolor of charcoal and moss, the magnolias hanging their heavy heads like mourners at a graveside. Davis stumbled inside, his denim jacket soaked through and clinging to his frame like a second skin. Dark bruised hollows hung beneath his eyes, and his hands vibrated with a tremor that made the documents he carried rustle like dry leaves in a wind tunnel. I guided him to the kitchen chair, the smell of stale coffee and wet fabric filling the room with the particular atmosphere of a crisis that had been fermenting overnight. "You look like a building about to come down, son," I said, keeping my voice low. "I have not slept, Dad." His voice cracked as he slumped forward. "Every time I close my eyes, I see my bank account hitting 0. It is like a countdown. I cannot stop." He spread the documents across the table with the frantic energy of a man emptying his pockets before a search. The Heritage Art Preservation Fund prospectus. 17 pages of glossy paper, embossed with gold foil that caught the dim kitchen light and screamed of exclusivity and impossible returns. The paper was thick and expensive. It felt like a funeral program printed for a rich man's future. "She did not just suggest the investment, Dad." His whisper was barely audible. "She has already drafted my resignation letter from the brokerage account. She has the mobile transfer queued on her phone. All she needs is my thumbprint to authorize the final push." The clinical efficiency made my skin prickle. You want to know the difference between a bad investment and a crime? A bad investment makes you feel stupid. A crime makes you feel special. That is how they sink the hooks. They make you believe you are the chosen one, the only person smart enough to see the opportunity. By the time you realize the opportunity was a trapdoor, your savings are already in freefall. I pulled the documents toward me and began the examination with a professional hunger I had not felt since I turned in my badge. My eyes scanned the fine print with the intensity of a man searching charred wreckage for the point of ignition. Buried in the third appendix, I found it. A subscription agreement clause that did not simply request an investment, but granted the fund full power of attorney over the investor's entire estate in the event of what it called market recalibration. It was a blank check for total financial annihilation, wrapped in language designed to make your eyes glaze over before you reach the lethal paragraph. Do you know why scammers use fine print? Because they know the average person's attention collapses after the third. Whereas, and here too, they bet your boredom against your life savings. And they win that bet almost every single time. I flipped to the leadership page and felt my breath hitch. Listed as Director of Acquisitions was a name that hit me like a beam falling from a burning ceiling. Julian Cross. I stared at those two words and felt 8 years of cold case frustration surge back into my bloodstream. Julian Cross had been the shadow at the center of an arson-for-profit ring I investigated in the Lowcountry when Davis was still in college. Cross orchestrated the systematic burning of underinsured historic properties, collecting inflated payouts through shell companies, before vanishing like smoke through a cracked window. We never caught him. The case went cold, and I carried it into retirement like a splinter lodged too deep to extract. Margot was not just running a boutique investment scam. She was connected to a man who burned buildings and bankrupted families as a business model. Davis, I said, keeping my voice level despite the earthquake in my chest. Tell me everything about the DUI. Every detail. His face drained of color. He told me how Margot had presented the dashcam footage 6 months ago, casually over dinner, as though she had stumbled across it while organizing files. She told him his firm would terminate him instantly. She told him child services would question his fitness as a father. She told him the only protection for Elise was to trust her with the finances. She had transformed his deepest shame into a leash and had been tightening it every month since. She did not find that footage by accident, I said. The certainty forged by 1,000 interrogations. Someone located that archive, paid for access, and delivered it on a schedule. This is not a wife managing finances. This is an operation. I crossed to the mahogany bookshelf. Behind a first edition Hemingway that Lucille gave me for our 30th anniversary, I pressed a hidden latch and retrieved the burner phone from the false bottom of my humidor. The keypad light glowed like a predator's eye in the dim study. The smell of old tobacco and cedar clung to the plastic casing as I punched in a number memorized years ago and never intended to use again. Renata Voss answered on the second ring. 9 years as my best investigator at the state fire marshal's office. A woman with the patience of a sniper and a mind that processed evidence the way a furnace processes fuel. Completely and without mercy. Hank Beaumont, she said, her tone shifting from professional to surprised. You have not called this line since your retirement dinner. I have got a live burn inside my own house, Renata. I need the deep dive. I told her about the Heritage Fund documents and the ghost watermark I had noticed in the prospectus margin. A faint, stylized emblem that belonged to no legitimate institution. I told her about Julian Cross. A pause followed. Heavy and professional, lasting 4 beats too long. That watermark is not just a signature, Hank, she said, dropping an octave. We have flagged it in 3 active fraud investigations across the Southeast this quarter. Intelligence links it to a forgery specialist operating out of Savannah. This is not a solo act. I gave her the name and social security number from Davis's joint tax return, Margot Langley. Renata's keyboard began to clatter, a rhythmic, urgent percussion through the receiver, Then the typing stopped. The silence that followed was the kind I had only heard at crime scenes. The silence of someone who has uncovered something that changes the shape of the entire investigation. "Hank," she whispered, "send me everything you have on this woman. Right now. Because the name you just gave me is raising flags that go a lot deeper than investment fraud." I sent Renata everything I had within 90 seconds, my fingers moving across the keyboard with the grim efficiency of a man assembling evidence against a clock he could hear but not see. Davis sat across from me in the study, his wet jacket draped over the back of the chair like a shedskin, his eyes tracking my movements with the desperate focus of a patient watching a surgeon. The rain had not stopped. It drummed against the windows of the old house with a persistence that felt less like weather and more like an interrogation technique. Renata's voice returned to the line after what felt like an hour, but was closer to 4 minutes. I could hear the change in her breathing before she spoke, that subtle shift from investigative rhythm to the shallow, controlled intake of someone who has just pulled a live wire out of a wall and is deciding how to tell you the house is about to burn. "Hank, I need you to sit down for this." "I am sitting, Renata." "Then hold on to the chair." A pause. The sound of a single mouse, click, echoing through the receiver, like a hammer tapping a coffin nail. "The woman living in your son's house is not Margot Langley." The real Margot Langley was reported missing during Hurricane Matthew in October of 2016. She was a 31-year-old occupational therapist living near Edisto Beach. When the storm hit, her vehicle was found submerged in a tidal creek off Highway 17. The body was never recovered. The county listed her as presumed deceased after 12 months. The air in my study suddenly felt like it had been pulled from the room by a backdraft. I looked at Davis, who was staring at me with an expression I had seen on the faces of homeowners standing in front of a structure they no longer recognized. The woman who slept beside him every night, the woman who held their daughter, was wearing the identity of a dead girl, like a borrowed coat. The current Oregon driver's license registered to Margot Langley was issued 3 years ago, using a birth certificate extracted from storm-damaged county records. Renata continued, her voice now carrying the measured cadence of someone reading from a case file that keeps getting worse. "The hurricane destroyed the Colleton County Courthouse Annex, where the originals were stored. Someone rebuilt a paper identity from the debris. It is clean work, Hank. Professional. How do you tell a man that the woman who shares his bed, who nursed his daughter through a midnight fever, who calls his mother by her first name and brings pecan pie to Sunday dinner, is a phantom assembled from the wreckage of a natural disaster?" I watched Davis process the information in real time, his face cycling through confusion, denial, and a slow dawning horror that settled into his features like frost forming on glass. "If Margot is a ghost," I said, forcing my voice into the low clinical register that had carried me through 3 decades of delivering bad news, "then who is the woman holding my granddaughter?" "She is what we call a total immersion operative," Renata replied. "Someone who does not just steal a name. They inhabit it. They rebuild the entire life from the ground up, relationships, habits, history, all of it constructed to pass inspection. This is not identity theft, Hank. This is identity architecture." The nausea was immediate and visceral. Every memory my son possessed of his marriage, every whispered plan, every shared laugh, was built on a foundation of stolen bones and professional forgery. My mind involuntarily returned to the Hurricane Matthew report. No witnesses. A vehicle submerged in a tidal creek. A body that conveniently vanished in storm surge. It occurred to me with a surge of professional coldness that the imposter might not have simply stolen a dead woman's name. She might have cleared the path for the theft herself. Renata shifted gears before I could voice the suspicion. Her tone sharpened as she pulled a second file, and I heard the rapid clicking of a mouse that told me she was navigating a database I no longer had clearance to access. "I need to tell you about Eugene Thibodeau," she said. 73 years old. Decorated Marine. Lived in a historic home on East Gaston Street in Savannah that had been in his family since Reconstruction. 3 years ago, the woman you know as Margot was working at a boutique wealth management firm in Savannah. She became Eugene's primary advisor after his wife passed. She was his light, Hank. She remembered his birthday. She brought him gumbo on Veterans Day. And then, with surgical precision, she presented the limited window for a life-changing investment. I could hear where this was going. The pattern was a furnace I had walked through before. Eugene did not lose his $110,000 to a bad market, Renata said, her voice carrying a weight that told me she had met the man and seen the damage firsthand. He lost it to a consultant who remembered his birthday and called him by his rank. It is a grooming cycle. She does not ask for the money until she is the only person the victim trusts. And the house? I asked, already knowing the answer the way you know the ending of a fire before the last beam falls. 6 months after the money disappeared, Eugene's home caught fire. Electrical fault, according to the official report. 150 years of family history reduced to ash in a single night. She paused, and I could feel the gravity of the next sentence before it arrived. The property had been reappraised at 3 times its market value 2 months before the fire. The appraisal was conducted by a firm that no longer exists, operating out of a Savannah address that turned out to be a mailbox service above a dry cleaner. Pattern recognition is a blessing until it starts showing you the shape of your own family's executioner. I looked at my son and saw the recognition spreading across his face like a stain. Renata, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The 3 fires in Charleston over the last 2 years. The historic properties on Trad Street, on Church Street, on East Battery. All of them were residential. All of them were ruled electrical. And all of them had been recently appraised. The silence on the line was confirmation enough. Davis signed the insurance claims on 2 of those properties, I continued, the words tasting like charcoal. He works for the carrier. He processed the payouts without knowing that his wife had lit the matches and inflated the values. She turned my son into an unwitting accomplice to arson. Renata's exhale was audible, a sharp release of professional restraint. There is one more thing, Hank. I pulled the targeting file from the Eugene Thibodeau case. It is a list of families the ring was tracking for future operations. Your son's name was on it. But it was not just his name. She paused, and I gripped the edge of my desk so hard the wood groaned. Next to Davis Beaumont, someone had written your home address and 2 words in red ink. Primary objective, : the vault. The rain lashed the windows as though the house itself was trying to warn me. My son had never been the target. He was just the door. And the vault they were coming for was mine. I did not sleep that night. Sleep is a luxury reserved for men who believe their perimeter is secure, and mine had been breached so thoroughly that even the shadows in my own study felt like they were reporting to someone else. By midnight, the rain had intensified into a full assault on the old house, the water hammering the slate roof with a violence that matched the drumming in my chest. Lucille had gone to bed after I told her everything Renata had revealed. She did not cry. She went quiet in the particular way of a woman who has decided that grief can wait until after the war is won. I moved through the darkened hallway, past the framed photographs of 6 generations of Beaumonts that lined the walls like silent witnesses, and entered my study. The room smelled of old paper, polished walnut, and the faint metallic tang of the gun oil I used to maintain the service weapon I no longer carried. I reached for the hidden keypad behind the first edition Hemingway on the shelf. The electronic beep of the safe sounded like a gunshot in the midnight silence. I opened the floor safe, expecting to find my collection of antique maritime charts intact. These were not casual acquisitions. They represented 40 years of careful study and significant investment, maps charted by cartographers whose hands had traced the coastline of a world that no longer existed. A 1762 survey of Charleston Harbor. A British Admiralty chart of the Gulf Stream, dated 1809. A hand-colored map of the Sea Islands that predated the Civil War. Together, they constituted a substantial portion of my retirement hedge and an irreplaceable archive of Southern maritime history. At first glance, nothing appeared disturbed. The felt-lined trays were in order. The humidity control indicator was green, and the inventory tags were aligned with the precision I demanded. But the moment I lifted the Charleston Harbor survey, I felt it. A wrongness in the weight. A lightness that had no business being there. As subtle as a counterfeit bill that looks perfect until you hold it to the light. My hands, steady after 30 years of handling evidence at fire scenes, carried the chart to my workbench. I clicked on the overhead lamp and positioned the digital scale, its high-pitched calibration tone echoing off the mahogany walls. The reading confirmed what my fingers already knew. The chart was off by exactly 0.4 grams. I adjusted my jeweler's loop and examined the paper fiber under magnification. There they were. Microscopic inconsistencies in the weave pattern, a fractional variation in the ink density, and stamped into the lower margin like a whispered confession. The ghost watermark. The same stylized emblem Renata had flagged from the Heritage Fund documents. The same mark that connected Julian Cross to a network of forgers operating out of Savannah. I went through the rest of the collection with the methodical fury of a man dismantling a bomb. Chart after chart told the same story. Over 40% of my collection had been systematically swapped for high-quality reproductions that held absolutely no value. Decades of acquisition, replaced with painted paper and professional lies. "You look like gold," I muttered to the empty room, holding a fake 1809 Admiralty chart up to the lamp. "But you are just ink and greed." As I tilted the last counterfeit case, a small black object tumbled onto the felt surface of the workbench. It was a GPS tracker no larger than a coat button, hidden inside the hollowed-out lining of the case. Its tiny red light blinked once, twice, 3 times, a silent heartbeat confirming that the woman who had been walking through my home and stealing my history had also been monitoring my every movement. I stared at that blinking light and felt the temperature of my fury drop from hot rage to the kind of cold, surgical anger that builds bridges to courtrooms. I checked the digital log on the safe's interior panel. The last unauthorized access had occurred 3 months ago, authenticated by Lucille's biometric bypass. My wife had not opened that safe in years. She never touched the charts alone. The implication landed like a fist. Margot had been organizing those spa evenings at our house with increasing frequency over the past year, always insisting Lucille try some new hand treatment or facial mask. I now understood why. She had been harvesting my wife's fingerprints while Lucille dozed in the living room recliner, her hands softened and exposed by whatever botanical concoction Margot had prepared. A man's home is his castle, until he realizes the queen has been selling the bricks from the inside out. My sanctuary had been converted into a showroom for a thief who did not need a crowbar because she had been handed the keys with a smile and a casserole dish. I needed a second opinion. Not a detective's instinct, but a forensic verdict. I reached out to Stephen Hamill, a man who had spent 20 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government. Someone who could find a missing penny buried under a mountain of corporate debris. I had sent him the encrypted Heritage Fund files 2 hours earlier, and the tone of his voice when he answered told me the news was as bad as I had feared. "Hank, this is not an investment document," Stephen said, his voice crackling through the secure line. "It is a suicide note for a bank account." He explained that the Heritage Fund was a masterclass in what he called empty architecture. While the subscription agreement looked dense and official, the schedule of physical assets was intentionally left blank, creating a legal limbo where invested money simply ceased to exist on paper. Even more insidious, the fund was a mirror of a legitimate high-performing preservation trust based in New York. A careful investor would search the name, find glowing reviews, and never realize the routing number on their contract led to an offshore account in Nassau. "How long do we have, Stephen?" I asked, my hand tightening on the cold phone receiver. 72 hours, he replied. Once a wire transfer hits the primary intake account, in this case, a credit union in the Bahamas, the money enters what I call the laundry cycle. They split it, layer it through shell companies across 3 jurisdictions, and then it simply evaporates. You are looking at a 3-day half-life for your son's entire future. Then Stephen delivered the detail that stopped my heart. He had traced the email metadata from the prospectus Davis had given me. "Hank, this document was not sent from a corporate server," he said. "It was sent from an IP address inside your own house at 3:15 in the morning 2 days ago." I felt a surge of ice water flood my veins. Margot had been sitting in my guest room, using my own wireless network, sending the instruments of my son's financial destruction while I slept 20 feet away. The betrayal had crossed from financial into territorial. The hunter was inside the camp, using my own fire to sharpen her knives. The rain started at 11:14. I know because I was sitting in my study watching the security feed when the first drops hit the lens of camera 3 and blurred the magnolia in the side yard into a white smear. Lucille had gone to bed an hour earlier. Davis was at his apartment downtown. And Margot, according to the GPS ping Renata had placed on her vehicle that afternoon, was parked at a wine bar on King Street. I had the house to myself. And for the first time in 28 years, that fact made my stomach turn. I locked the study door, pulled the Hemingway First Edition from the third shelf, and pressed the recessed panel behind it. The Whitfield safe is a custom-job 800-pound fire-rated steel, dual biometric, plus a 6-digit rotating code. I had it installed in 2009 after a string of burglaries hit Margot's prints were never added. I was certain of that. The safe opened with a soft hydraulic sigh. Inside, the maritime chart collection sat in acid-free linen cases, arranged by century. 14 charts, spanning from 1742 to 1891, the crown jewels of my retirement, acquired over decades from auctions in London, Annapolis, and Beaufort. Some men collect watches. I collected the cartography of coastlines that no longer exist. I reached for the 1798 Hayward Coastal Survey first. It had always been my favorite hand-inked soundings of the Cooper River mouth drawn by a man who had watched Fort Moultrie rise from palmetto logs. The case felt right. The weight felt right. But when I unrolled the chart on my desk and placed it under the magnification lamp, something was wrong. The ink density along the eastern channel was too uniform. Authentic iron gall ink from that period degrades unevenly darker where the nib paused, lighter on long strokes, with microfractures visible under 10 times magnification. This chart showed none of that. The strokes were consistent, machine perfect. The kind of precision that comes from a high-resolution Giclée transfer onto period-appropriate paper. I placed the chart on my digital postal scale. 412.6 grams. My acquisition ledger, a habit from my investigator days, listed the original at 413 even. A discrepancy of 0.4 grams. Insignificant to anyone else. But I had weighed every chart the day I cataloged them, and paper does not lose mass in a sealed, humidity-controlled safe. I checked the next chart, then the next. Then every single one. 6 of the 14 had been swapped. The 1798 Hayward. The 1812 Drayton Harbor Survey. The 1847 Pinckney Tidal Map. The 1856 Grimke Plantation Boundary. The 1871 Post-War Shipping Corridor. And the 1891 Phosphate Mining Route along the Ashley River. Each one showed the same telltale uniformity under magnification, the same fractional weight loss, and when I angled the lamp to 45 degrees, the same ghost watermark I had first seen in the Heritage Fund prospectus. A tiny, almost invisible crown and anchor motif, embedded in the paper fibers. Julian Cross's signature. 43% of my collection had been replaced with forgeries. The originals, conservatively valued at $380,000, were gone. I sat back in my chair and pressed my palms against my eyes until I saw red. Then I opened the last case, the 1742 Middleton chart, the oldest and most valuable piece. It was authentic, I confirmed it 3 times. But tucked beneath the linen lining of its case, no larger than a shirt button, was a GPS tracking device. Model SL 400, commercial grade, with a transmit range of 2 miles and a battery life of 18 months. It was still blinking. Someone was watching this safe. Someone knew every time it opened. I pulled the safe's internal access log, a feature I had insisted on during installation. The log recorded every biometric scan with a timestamp. The entries from the past 6 months told a story that made my hands shake. March 14. 2:07 a.m. biometric. Lucille Beaumont. April 2. 1:40. 2 a.m. biometric. Lucille Beaumont. April 19. 3:11 a.m. biometric. Lucille Beaumont. May 8. 2:33 a.m. biometric. Lucille Beaumont. 4 entries. All between 1 and 3 in the morning. All on nights when I cross-referenced my own calendar and confirmed I had been at the firehouse for overnight shift coverage or at the regional conference in Columbia. Lucille does not open the safe. She has never opened the safe. In 19 years of marriage to that vault, she has expressed exactly 0 interest in maritime cartography. She calls the charts Hank's old boat papers and walks past them the way she walks past my fishing rods with affectionate indifference. I went upstairs and found her reading glasses on the nightstand. I held them under the magnification lamp. The nose pads showed traces of silicone residue, the kind used in high-quality fingerprint molds. The same residue was on the decorative hand mirror Margot had given Lucille for Christmas, the one she used every morning. And on the ceramic tea mug Margot had custom-ordered for Lucille's birthday, World's Best Grandma, in gold script. Margot had harvested my wife's fingerprints during their spa nights, their kitchen conversations, their quiet moments of trust. She had manufactured a biometric bypass using the intimacy of family. I called Stephen Hamill at midnight. He answered on the second ring. Forensic accountants who work fraud cases keep the same hours as arsonists. I gave him the Heritage Fund prospectus number and asked him to trace the financial architecture. "Give me 40 minutes," he said. He called back in 32. "The Heritage Fund is an empty architecture," Hamill said, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man reading X-rays. "It mirrors a legitimate family trust registered in New York, same name. Similar structure, almost identical documentation, but the New York entity manages real assets. This one routes deposits through a credit union in Nassau, Bahamas, then disperses them across 3 shell companies in 3 different jurisdictions within a 72-hour cycle. By the time a depositor realizes something is wrong, the money has been washed, dried, and folded into someone else's portfolio." "Can you trace the origin of the prospectus document itself?" I asked. "Already did. The metadata shows it was generated from a device using an IP address registered to your home network." Timestamp: 3:15 a.m. 2 days before Davis brought you the printed copy. The document was created inside your house, Hank. Whoever built this prospectus was sitting in your guest room, using your Wi-Fi, while you slept 30 feet away. I thanked him and hung up. The rain had intensified. I could hear it hammering the slate roof, running through the copper gutters my great-grandfather had installed in 1923. This house had survived hurricanes, wars, and a century of Charleston summers. It had never been infiltrated. I looked at the GPS tracker blinking on my desk. I looked at the silicone residue on my wife's reading glasses. I looked at the access log showing my wife's name attached to crimes she never committed. The hunter had been inside the camp all along, using my own fire to sharpen her knives. I did not sleep. At 5:47 a.m., I was still at my desk, staring at the GPS tracker under the lamp, like a man studying a tumor he had just removed from his own body. The rain had stopped sometime around 4, and the first cardinals were testing the air outside the window with short, cautious notes. Charleston mornings have a quality of light that makes everything look forgiven. The houses whiter, the ironwork softer, the moss more silver than gray. But forgiveness requires honesty, and there was nothing honest left inside these walls. Lucille came downstairs at 6:15. She was wearing the blue linen robe Davis had given her for Mother's Day and carrying her reading glasses in her left hand, the same glasses I had examined 4 hours earlier for silicone residue. She kissed the top of my head without looking at my face, which meant she could tell I had not slept and was choosing not to address it. 31 years of marriage gives you a vocabulary of silences. Coffee's made, I said. You look terrible, she said. Rough night. She poured her coffee, added exactly 1/3 of a spoonful of sugar the way she always does, and sat across from me at the kitchen island. The morning light caught the bare skin of her ring finger, and that was when I noticed. Where's your anniversary band? I asked. Lucille looked at her hand as if seeing it for the first time. I took it off last week for the spa. Margot said the salt scrub could damage the setting. She paused. I put it in my jewelry box. It's upstairs. Something cold moved through my chest. Show me. She must have heard it in my voice, not a request but an instruction. The tone I had used on witness stands and in burning buildings when there was no time for diplomacy. She set her coffee down without a word and led me upstairs. Lucille's jewelry box was a 19th-century rosewood chest that had belonged to her grandmother. It sat on the vanity in our bedroom, positioned between a silver-framed photograph of Davis's college graduation and a porcelain dish where she kept hairpins. She opened the lid and went still. The anniversary band was gone. So was her mother's pearl necklace, a 42-inch strand of Akoya pearls with a platinum clasp that had been in her family since 1961. So was the emerald brooch her father had bought in Cartagena during his Navy service. So were the diamond earrings I had given her for our 25th anniversary, the sapphire pendant from our trip to Asheville, and a pair of antique cameo pins that had survived 4 generations of Beaumont women. The box was not empty. That was the cruel precision of it. Margot had left behind the costume pieces, the fashion jewelry, the department store bracelets, the souvenir rings from vacations. She had taken only the items with significant monetary value and replaced their positions in the velvet compartments with pieces of similar size and color. A cubic zirconia, where the diamond had been. A glass pearl strand where the Akoya necklace had rested. If you glanced at the box casually, everything looked normal. You had to touch it to know the truth. Lucille picked up the glass pearls and held them to the light. Her hand was steady, but her breathing had changed, shorter, shallower. The rhythm of someone absorbing a blow. These aren't mine, she said. No, the emerald brooch. My father. I know. She placed the fake pearls back in the box with a gentleness that broke my heart. She did not cry. Lucille Beaumont is not a woman who cries when she is wounded. She goes quiet. The way deep water goes quiet before a current shifts. How long? She asked. Months. Maybe longer. Margot. It was not a question. I nodded. Lucille closed the jewelry box and pressed both palms flat on the vanity as if steadying a boat. Then she looked at me with an expression I had seen only twice in our marriage, once when Davis broke his arm falling from the pecan tree at age 7, and once when the doctor told her about the shadow on her lung that turned out to be nothing. It was the face of a woman calculating the distance between what she believed and what was real. Tell me everything, she said. So I did. I told her about the sleeve tug at the party, about the Heritage Fund prospectus, and the hidden power of attorney clause, about the voice recording on Margot's phone and the remote access tool, about the unauthorized entries using Davis's credentials, about Renata Voss and the real Margot Langley who disappeared in Hurricane Matthew, about Eugene Thibodeau and his burned house, about the 3 Charleston fires and the ghost watermark, about the swap charts and the GPS tracker, and the biometric bypass, using her own fingerprints harvested from objects Margot had given her as gifts. It took 22 minutes. Lucille did not interrupt once. When I finished, she walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Margot had planted hydrangeas last spring, blue ones, the color of trust. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the cardinal outside to complete an entire cycle of its song. She used my fingerprints, Lucille said finally. She sat next to me on this bed, painted my nails, told me I had beautiful hands, and she was making molds. Yes, she gave Elise that stuffed rabbit for her birthday. She braided my hair last Tuesday. She called me Mom. Yes. Lucille turned from the window, Her eyes were dry and hard as Charleston brick. "What do you need from me? I need you to act normal. Smile at her. Cook with her. Let her braid your hair. Do not change a single thing. If she suspects we know, she'll run. And she'll take Elise with her. Davis's name is on 2 insurance claims he didn't know about. If Margot disappears before we have documentation, our son goes to prison for arson fraud." Lucille absorbed this the way she absorbed everything completely, without visible fracture. She picked up her coffee mug from the vanity where she had set it, took a sip that had gone cold, and nodded once. "I'll need new reading glasses," she said. "These ones seem to have something on them." That was the moment I understood that whatever Margot Langley had planned for this family, she had not accounted for Lucille. Con artists study their marks for weakness. They look for vanity, loneliness, greed, fear. They do not plan for a 61-year-old woman who can smile at the person who robbed her blind and mean it just enough to be believed. I spent the rest of that morning cataloging losses. The jewelry was conservatively appraised at $91,000. Combined with the chart forgeries at $380,000, the pension portal access Renata had flagged, and the Heritage Fund deposits already routed through Nassau, the total exposure exceeded $540,000. And that was only what we had found so far. At noon, my phone buzzed. A text from Davis. "She asked me this morning if your safe has a fire rating. Said she was worried about hurricane season. Dad, she's going for the 1742 chart. The last authentic Middleton. The most valuable piece in my collection. The one chart she had not yet touched because it was the one chart that still had a GPS tracker in its case. The tracker she had planted to monitor the safe's opening pattern before making her final move. She was not done. She was accelerating. Tuesday morning, Margot made blueberry pancakes for Elise. I watched from the hallway as she cut them into small triangles and arranged them on the plate in the shape of a star. Elise clapped her hands and said, "Mama Star." And Margot kissed the top of her head with a tenderness so convincing that for 3 full seconds, I doubted everything I knew. That is the nature of a professional. They do not simply lie. They inhabit the lie until it grows a heartbeat. Lucille sat at the kitchen table eating toast and smiling at Margot, with the serene warmth of a woman who had not spent the previous night cataloging stolen jewelry in a spiral notebook. She complimented the pancakes. She asked Margot about her afternoon plans. She touched Margot's shoulder as she passed behind her chair. The performance was flawless, so flawless that I felt a chill watching it. Because it meant my wife had a capacity for deception I had never seen in 31 years, and she had summoned it overnight, like a language she had always known but never needed to speak. At 9:15, I drove to Renata's office on Calhoun Street. She was waiting with 2 folders and a laptop open to a frozen video frame. The image showed a dark road, headlights cutting through rain, and the interior of a patrol car's dash cam. I recognized the timestamp format, Charleston County Sheriff's Office. "This was recorded 14 months ago," Renata said. October 19th. Davis Beaumont pulled over on Highway 17 near Ravenel Bridge at 11:42 p.m. Blood alcohol .09. Just over the legal limit. I sat down slowly. Davis does not drink heavily. He never has. A .09 meant 2 glasses of wine on an empty stomach, maybe 3, and bad timing. He was arrested? He was not. Renata pressed play. The footage showed the officer approaching Davis's window. Davis was cooperative, polite, clearly nervous. He performed the field sobriety tests adequately, but not perfectly. The officer returned to the patrol car, ran Davis's license, and then the footage showed this clearly received a phone call. The officer's body language changed. He returned to Davis's window, handed back the license, and told him to drive home safely. No citation, no arrest, no record. "Who made the call?" I asked. The call came from a burner phone registered to a prepaid account purchased with cash at a Walmart in North Charleston. The account was activated 2 days before the traffic stop and deactivated the following morning. The officer involved, Deputy Franklin Mays, resigned from the department 3 months later, and moved to Myrtle Beach. He now works as a private security consultant. Margot arranged the stop. Arranged the dismissal, and recorded the entire sequence on a separate device. Renata opened the second folder. This is a still frame from a different angle, not the dash cam. A phone camera, positioned on the passenger seat of a vehicle, parked approximately 40 yards behind the patrol car. The angle captures Davis's face, the officer's badge number, and the license plate. Professional surveillance footage. The implications settled over me like ash. Margot had orchestrated a DUI arrest, arranged for its suppression through a corrupt deputy, and preserved evidence of both the offense and the cover-up. She had manufactured a weapon. If Davis ever challenged her, ever questioned the Heritage Fund, ever threatened to leave, she could produce footage, proving he had driven drunk, been stopped by law enforcement, and been released through corruption. His insurance license would be revoked, his professional reputation destroyed. He would face criminal charges not for the DUI itself, which was minor, but for the cover-up, which was obstruction of justice. She built a cage, I said. A very elegant cage. Renata agreed. And your son has been living inside it without knowing the bars were there. I understood now why Davis had not simply confronted Margot. Why he had used the sleeve tug signal instead of words. Why his voice on the phone carried the particular flatness of a man who has measured every exit and found them all sealed. He did not know about the DUI tape specifically, but he sensed the architecture of control surrounding him, the way an animal senses a fence it cannot see. There's more, Renata said. She turned the laptop toward me. I traced Deputy Mays's financial records after his resignation. He received a single payment of $12,000 from a company called Low Country Heritage Consulting LLC, registered in South Carolina 6 days before the traffic stop and dissolved 8 days after. The registered agent was a man named Julian Cross. Julian Cross. The name from the Heritage Fund prospectus. The Director of Acquisitions. The ghost watermark on my forged charts. Every thread in this investigation led back to the same spider. Julian Cross is not a single person, Renata continued. Or rather, he may be. But the name functions as a brand. I found Julian Cross signatures on corporate filings in 4 states. South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Louisiana. Different handwriting each time. Different notary stamps. The entity behind the name operates like a franchise. Local operatives handle local targets. Margot is the Charleston branch. I drove home with the windows down, letting the salt air off the harbor scour the inside of the truck. The Ashley River was flat and brown beneath the bridge, carrying logs and trash from the previous night's rain toward the ocean. I thought about Eugene Thibodeau in Savannah, sitting in a rented apartment because his house had burned. I thought about the 3 families on Trad Street and Church Street and East Battery whose homes had been turned into insurance claims. I thought about Davis cutting blueberry pancakes into triangles for a daughter who might not be his. At 2:17 p.m., I pulled into the parking lot of a hardware store on Meeting Street and called Davis from a prepaid phone I had purchased that morning. "Do you know about the DUI?" I asked. Silence. Then, she told me she made it go away. She said she had a friend in the department. She said it was a favor. It was not a favor. It was a leash. She recorded everything. The stop, the dismissal, a second camera angle. She owns you with that footage, Davis. I heard him breathing. Shallow, rapid. The respiration of a man realizing the floor beneath him is thinner than he thought. "What do I do?" he asked. "Tomorrow afternoon?" "You invite Margot to coffee at the Blind Tiger on Broad Street. Tell her you want to discuss expanding the Heritage Fund to include your father's maritime collection. Be enthusiastic. Be specific. Mention the Middleton chart by name. Mention its appraised value. And wear the blue jacket, the one with the inside breast pocket. Why the blue jacket? Because I'm going to sew a recording device into the lining tonight, and that jacket has the thickest fabric." Another silence. Longer this time. Dad, if she finds it, she won't find it. I've wired informants in buildings that were on fire. I can handle a coffee shop. He exhaled. It was not a laugh, but it was close enough to one that I took it as permission. That night, after Lucille turned off her lamp and the house settled into its familiar chorus of creaks and cooling pipes, I sat at the kitchen table with Davis's jacket, a seam ripper, a Tascam DR05X, digital recorder, the size of a lighter, and 30 years of practice at hiding things in places no one thinks to look. The recorder fit perfectly behind the interior pocket, secured with 2 strips of fabric tape, and positioned so the microphone faced outward through the buttonhole. I tested it 3 times. Clean audio at conversational distance up to 12 feet. I hung the jacket on the back of Davis's chair and looked at it in the dim light. A blue linen jacket. A recording device. A coffee shop on Broad Street. It was not much of a plan, but fires are not fought with grand strategy. They are fought with positioning, with patience, and with knowing exactly where the oxygen is flowing. Tomorrow, I would find out what Margot says when she thinks she is winning. The blind tiger sits on Broad Street between a law office and an antique dealer. The kind of Charleston establishment that survives by pretending it has always been there. Exposed brick the color of dried blood, ceiling fans turning slow enough to count the blades, a brass-railed bar that has absorbed a century of bourbon and whispered negotiations. On a Wednesday afternoon in late May, it is quiet enough to record a confession without interference. I arrived at 1:40, 30 minutes early. Gray polo, reading glasses, a copy of the Post and Courier folded to the crossword. An old man doing a puzzle in a quiet bar. Invisible. The Tascam in Davis's jacket was transmitting to a flesh-colored receiver in my left ear, smaller than a hearing aid. Renata was parked on King Street, 2 blocks away, with a directional backup recorder aimed at the courtyard windows. 2 systems. 2 recordings. 2 admissible copies. Redundancy is not paranoia. It is professionalism. Davis arrived at 2:11 wearing the blue jacket and a smile that cost him everything he had. I could see the strain in the muscles around his eyes, the effort of performing ease. He ordered 2 iced coffees and chose a courtyard table 12 feet from the nearest occupied seat, exactly as I had instructed. Margot arrived at 2:14 in a white sundress and sandals, her hair loose, carrying a canvas tote printed with the Charleston Farmers Market logo. She looked like a woman on her way to buy peaches. She kissed Davis on the cheek, sat across from him, and crossed her ankles, with the posture of someone who has never been afraid of anything. "You look happy," she said. "I am happy. I've been thinking about the Heritage Fund, about expanding the family's portfolio. I want to talk about Dad's collection." Through the earpiece, I heard her breathing shift. Slight acceleration, the kind a predator makes when prey steps closer. If you have never listened for it, you would miss it. I had listened for it in interrogation rooms for 3 decades, specifically the Middleton. Davis continued. The 1,742 Coastal Survey. Dad had it appraised at $275, but the real market value is higher, $350, maybe $380. It's the only surviving chart from the original expedition. Margot leaned forward 2 inches. The geometry of the conversation changed from casual to operational. I had seen the same lean, in hundreds of interviews, the moment a suspect decides to trust the room. "The fund can absolutely accommodate physical holdings," she said. "Julian has structured the appraisal arm for exactly this. We'd need a certified valuation. I can arrange that, and the chart registers as a contributing asset under a custodial agreement. Your father retains physical possession, but the ownership interest transfers to the fund's trust structure." She was lying with the fluency of rehearsal. "The custodial agreement would transfer legal ownership to an entity controlled by Julian Cross. Hank Beaumont would hold the physical object while its value was extracted through the same Nassau pipeline that had already consumed $540,000. "What about the other charts?" Davis asked. "He has 14 total. All of them could be contributed." Julian calls them sleeping assets. We wake them up. 8 to 12% annually. First distribution at 18 months. Quarterly after that. Fabricated returns from a fund that generated nothing. Textbook Ponzi rotation, sustained only by fresh victims. I want to do this, Davis said. But I need to understand one thing. The DUI. 14 months ago, Highway 17. You said a friend in the department made it go away. Is that connected to any of this? The courtyard went quiet. A mockingbird on the iron railing cocked its head and flew. Margot did not move for 4 seconds. Then she smiled. That was a gift, Davis. The deputy owed someone a favor. It cost the fund a small administrative fee through a consulting entity, Low Country Heritage Consulting. Julian manages it separately from the investment arm. Clean separation. The point is your record stayed clean. Your license stayed active. That's what family does. She had just connected the DUI cover-up to Low Country Heritage Consulting, to Julian Cross, and to the Heritage Fund's financial structure. On tape. With a backup recording 2 blocks away, Davis reached for his coffee and took a long, slow sip. His hand was steady. I had never been more proud of my son. That makes sense, he said. I'll talk to Dad this weekend. Margot kissed him on the mouth, lingering. Proprietary, and walked out with her tote bag swinging like a woman who had just closed the deal of her life. I waited 4 minutes, paid for my coffee, and walked to Renata's car on King Street. She was replaying the audio through headphones, her face carrying the expression of a hunter examining fresh tracks. 12 minutes and 47 seconds of admissible confession, she said. She named the fund, named Cross, named the consulting entity, connected the DUI payoff, described the custodial mechanism, and quoted fabricated returns. South Carolina is a one-party consent state. Davis consented. Every word is clean. I leaned against the car and looked toward the harbor. The afternoon light was turning gold, and the church steeples cast long shadows across the rooftops. Charleston is a city built by people who understood that beauty and cruelty can share the same address. How soon can we move? I asked. Not yet. We have her. But we don't have Cross. Without Cross, she's a branch manager. We need the trunk. She was right. Cutting Margot loose without dismantling the network would mean another operative, another Eugene Thibodeau, another burned house. There's one more thing. Renata pulled a lab envelope from her bag. The DNA results come back tomorrow. Tomorrow. The word hung in the salt air between us like smoke from a fire that had not yet been lit. The call came at 8:23 on a Thursday morning. I was standing in the kitchen holding a coffee mug that said, "World's Best Grandpa, a gift from Margot." Naturally, when Renata's name appeared on the prepaid phone, I stepped onto the back porch and closed the door. The garden was wet from overnight rain, and the hydrangeas Margot had planted were blooming in clusters of impossible blue. Results are in, Renata said. Davis Beaumont is excluded as the biological father of Elise Beaumont. 0% probability of paternity. The markers don't share a regional population cluster. Whoever fathered that child has a genetic profile consistent with Northern European descent, Scandinavian or Baltic. Davis is French Cajun and Low Country Scots, Irish. It's not close, Hank. It's not ambiguous. It's 0. I sat down on the porch step. The wood was damp through my khakis. A mockingbird sang from the crepe myrtle at the edge of the yard, the same tree under which Elise had taken her first steps 10 months ago, while Davis filmed with both hands shaking and his voice saying, "Come on, baby girl, come to daddy." I had watched that video 40 times. I had memorized the way her face changed from concentration to delight as her feet discovered they could carry her. Come to daddy, and she had walked straight into his arms. 0%. There's a secondary finding, Renata continued. The biological mother's profile is consistent with the sample, confirming the imposter carried and delivered the child. Elise is biologically hers. The father is unknown, No match in any accessible database. But the regional markers are consistent with someone from the network. Julian Cross is listed on a Louisiana corporate filing with a Scandinavian surname variant, Cross, with a K. It was not coincidence. Nothing in this case was coincidence. Margot had not stumbled into Davis's life. She had been placed there, a woman with a manufactured identity, carrying a child fathered by someone within the organization, deployed to infiltrate a family whose patriarch had spent 28 years as a state fire marshal with access to investigation archives, insurance networks, and institutional trust that opens doors no amount of money can buy. Elise was not an accident. Elise was part of the architecture. I sat on the porch for 11 minutes without moving. I counted them by the mockingbird's song cycles. In 28 years of fire investigation, I had seen families destroyed by a single spark. Children carried out of buildings by strangers because the people who were supposed to protect them had failed. But this fire had started inside my son's marriage. Inside the body of a child he loved more than his own heartbeat. How do you tell a man that the daughter he bathes and feeds and reads to every night, the daughter whose first word was Dada, whose weight he can feel in his arms, even when she is not there, is not his? You do it the way you deliver every unbearable truth. You sit across from him, look him in the eye, and do not look away. I drove to Davis's apartment at noon. He opened the door in a wrinkled dress shirt and bare feet. Shadows pooled beneath his eyes. The apartment was sparse, a drafting table by the window, a framed photo of Elise on the bookshelf, a stack of Heritage Fund documents on the counter. He had been studying the way I taught him to study evidence, methodically, one page at a time. "Sit down," I said. He sat on the drafting stool and looked at me with the expression of a man who has already guessed the weight of what is coming but needs to hear it spoken before he can begin to carry it. "The DNA results came back this morning. You are not Elise's biological father. The probability is 0. The markers are definitive." Davis did not speak. He did not move. He stared at a point beyond my left shoulder, and I watched his face perform the most controlled act of devastation I have ever witnessed. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared once. His eyes went wet but did not overflow. Then slowly, like a man pulling himself out of deep water, he blinked, exhaled, and looked directly at me. "She's my daughter," he said. "Davis, I don't care what the markers say. I was in the delivery room. I cut the cord. I held her before anyone else on this earth held her. I have fed her every morning and bathed her every night, and I am the voice she calls for when she is afraid in the dark. Biology does not get to take that from me." His voice did not crack. It came out level and certain, the way load-bearing walls hold weight not because they choose to, but because that is what they were built to do. I looked at my son and saw something I had not seen before. Not the victim. Not the mark. I saw a father forged not by blood but by 2 a.m. feedings and emergency room visits, and the 10,000 ordinary acts of devotion that accumulate into something no DNA test can measure. "Then we fight for her," I said. "South Carolina recognizes psychological parent doctrine. You've been Elise's primary caregiver since birth. You're on the birth certificate. You have medical records, daycare enrollment, testimony from every person who has ever seen you with that child. Margot's real identity is stolen. Her financial dealings are fraudulent. When this goes to court, and it will, you'll have standing, and she'll have a criminal record." Davis walked to the bookshelf, picked up the framed photograph of Elise, and held it against his chest, the way a man holds something he has decided he will never release. "What's the next step?" he asked. "We find Julian Cross. The DNA suggests a connection, Scandinavian markers matching that surname variant. If Cross is Elise's biological father, the network didn't just steal from us. They planted a child inside our family as an operational asset." Davis closed his eyes. When he opened them, the grief was still there, but it had company, something harder. Something that looked like the expression I used to see in my own mirror before walking into a building that was still burning. "Find him," he said. "Find all of them." I drove home through the historic district with the windows down. The afternoon heat carried the smell of pluff mud and jasmine, and the old houses along Meeting Street stood in their rows like witnesses who had seen everything and said nothing. I thought about Elise sleeping with her arms above her head the way babies do, open, trusting, unaware that the world she was born into was built on forgery. She would never know this part. That was the promise I made on that drive. The one that would outlast every other commitment in this case. Whatever happened to Margot, to Cross, to the network, Elise would grow up believing she was loved without condition, because she was. Some fires you fight to save the building. Some fires you fight to save what is inside. Friday began with a knock on the front door at 7:12 a.m. Not the doorbell. A knock. 3 sharp strikes spaced evenly. The way law enforcement knocks. The way people knock when they want you to understand that what follows is not optional. I opened the door in my robe. A process server in a khaki uniform stood on the porch, holding a manila envelope and a clipboard. He was young, maybe 25, and he had the apologetic posture of a man who understood that the documents in his hand were about to ruin someone's morning. Hank Beaumont? Yes. You've been served. He handed me the envelope, had me sign the clipboard, and walked back to his car without looking at me again. Professional. Efficient. Gone in 40 seconds. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a temporary restraining order issued by the Charleston County Family Court, signed by Judge Evelyn Marsh, prohibiting Davis Beaumont from coming within 500 feet of Margot Langley or the minor child Elise Beaumont. The second was an emergency motion for sole custody filed by Margot's attorney, a name I did not recognize, Catherine Rames, from a firm on Meeting Street that specialized in high-asset family litigation. The grounds cited in the restraining order were specific and devastating. Margot alleged that Davis had exhibited escalating controlling behavior, had monitored her communications without consent, had made veiled threats regarding the custody of the minor child, and had enlisted his father, a retired law enforcement officer, to conduct unauthorized surveillance. She included 3 exhibits: a screenshot of a text message from Davis that read, "We need to talk about Elise's future," innocuous words, reframed as implicit threat. A photograph of Renata's parked car on King Street taken from the Blind Tiger's courtyard, proving Margot had spotted the backup surveillance, and a notarized statement from Deputy Franklin Mays claiming that Hank Beaumont had contacted him under false pretenses to extract confidential law enforcement information. Mace, the corrupt deputy she had paid $12,000 to dismiss Davis's DUI, now repackaged as a victim of Hank Beaumont's overreach. The audacity was architectural. I called Davis. He had already been served a separate order, delivered to his apartment at 6:55. His voice on the phone was flat, stripped of everything except function. "I can't see Elise," he said. "The order is effective immediately. If I go within 500 feet of the house, I get arrested." "I know, Dad. She's 2 years old. She's going to wake up and I won't be there. She's going to look for me and I won't." His voice broke for the first time since this began. Not a dramatic collapse. A single fracture, like a beam giving way under sustained load. He caught it, held it, pressed it back into place. "What do? We follow the order. To the letter. You do not go near that house. You do not contact Margot. You do not send a text message that could be interpreted as anything other than compliance. A temporary restraining order is not a conviction. It is a starting position. She has made the first move in a custody battle, and she has made it aggressively because she knows the evidence against her is mounting. This is not strength. This is acceleration before impact." I hung up and called Renata. She answered with a single word. "Saw it. She spotted your car. The courtyard photo." "Yes. She's more observant than I gave her credit for. Or someone in the network flagged the vehicle. Either way, the backup recording is still clean. She photographed the car, not the equipment. The audio is admissible regardless." Catherine Rames. "Do you know her?" High-end family attorney. Expensive. Technically brilliant. She doesn't take cases without a $50,000 retainer, which means someone funded this filing. Margot doesn't have visible income that justifies those fees. Julian Cross. Funding the legal counterattack the same way he funded the DUI dismissal and the Heritage Fund architecture. The network was protecting its operative, and the weapon they chose was the family court system, a venue where emotion carries as much weight as evidence, where a mother's tears can outweigh a forensic accountant's spreadsheet. At 10:15, a second knock came. This time, it was not a process server. It was a man I had not seen in 4 years, my older brother, Bernard Buddy Beaumont, standing on the porch in a seersucker suit and a Panama hat, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been to more courtrooms than most attorneys. Uncle Buddy is 71 years old. He practiced family law in Charleston for 43 years before retiring, and his reputation in the county courthouse is the kind that makes opposing counsel check their preparation twice. He is 6'4", thin as a heron, and has a voice like gravel soaked in honey, the voice of a man who can quote scripture and case law in the same sentence and make both sound like threats. "Lucille called me," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "She told me everything. Show me the filings." I handed him the restraining order and the custody motion. He read them standing in the hallway, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, his lips moving slightly the way they do when he is memorizing language he intends to dismantle. "Catherine Rames," he said. "Good attorney. Aggressive. But she's built this filing on a foundation of manufactured evidence and a corrupt witness. The Mays affidavit is perjury. We can prove payment through the Low Country Heritage Consulting records. The surveillance allegation is moot in a one-party consent state. And the text message exhibit is contextually neutral. Can you take the case? I came out of retirement 20 minutes ago." He set the briefcase on the hallway table and opened it. Inside were a yellow legal pad, 3 sharpened pencils, and a copy of the South Carolina Family Court Rules of Procedure that was so heavily annotated it looked like a medieval manuscript. "I'll file a motion to dissolve the TRO on Monday. Grounds: fraudulent identity of the petitioner, perjured supporting affidavit, and failure to establish imminent threat. I'll request an emergency hearing within 72 hours. And custody? Psychological parent doctrine. Davis has been Elise's sole consistent caregiver. We have medical records, pediatric appointments in his name, daycare enrollment, and once we introduce the criminal evidence, a biological mother whose real identity is stolen and whose financial dealings constitute ongoing felony fraud. No family court judge in this state will award sole custody to a woman who doesn't legally exist." Uncle Buddy removed his hat and hung it on the coat rack beside the door, the same rack where Davis used to hang his school backpack 30 years ago. The gesture was unhurried and deliberate. The way everything Buddy does is deliberate. He does not rush because he has learned that the law rewards patience more reliably than speed. One more thing, Ellis. The hearing will be before Judge Evelyn Marsh. She signed the temporary order, which means Rames chose her deliberately. Marsh is sympathetic to maternal claims, but Marsh is also rigorous on evidentiary standards. If we present the DNA results, the confession recording, and the financial forensics, Marsh will not be able to ignore them regardless of her inclinations. The facts will be louder than the framing. I looked at my brother, this tall, unhurried man who had spent his life navigating the space between what is legal and what is just, and felt something I had not felt since the birthday party. Not hope, exactly. Something more structural than hope. The sense that the foundation was holding. "Buddy," I said. "Thank you." He picked up a pencil and began writing on the legal pad. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when Elise is home. Saturday. 6 days since the birthday party. 6 days since Davis tugged my sleeve 3 times in the hallway, while Margot cut a cake shaped like a butterfly, and Elise clapped her frosting-covered hands. In 6 days I had uncovered a stolen identity, a forged chart collection, a biometric breach, a DUI blackmail scheme, an empty financial architecture routing money through Nassau, and a DNA result that proved my granddaughter was fathered by a ghost. And now my son could not hold his own child because a family court judge had signed a piece of paper built on perjury. Saturday was the day I decided to stop investigating and start ending. At 9 a.m., I met Renata, Stephen Hamill, and Uncle Buddy at Renata's office on Calhoun Street. The room was small, a converted law library, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a conference table covered in documents arranged in the precise geometry of a woman who thinks in timelines. Renata had pinned a map of the southeastern United States to the wall. Red pins marked each confirmed node of the Julian Cross network: Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, Baton Rouge, and newly added overnight Wilmington, North Carolina. 5 cities, Renata said. 5 local operatives using the Julian Cross brand. Each one follows the same playbook. Identify a target family with institutional access law enforcement, insurance, municipal government. Deploy a female operative with a manufactured identity and, in at least 2 confirmed cases, a child fathered within the network. Infiltrate the family, extract financial assets through a mirror fund architecture, then liquidate physical property through staged insurance events, fires, floods, theft claims. When the extraction is complete, the operative disappears, and the target family is left holding fraudulent paperwork that makes them look complicit. How many victims total? Buddy asked. Confirmed. 11 families across 5 states. Estimated losses: $4.2 million. 3 residential arsons, 1 commercial fire, and Eugene Thibodeau's house in Savannah. The FBI has had a file open on the network for 14 months, but has been unable to identify the central figure behind the Julian Cross name. Until now, Hamill said. He opened his laptop and turned it toward the table. On the screen was a corporate filing from Louisiana Cross Capital Partners, LLC, registered in Baton Rouge 18 months ago. The registered agent was a man named Anders Cross, age 41, with a mailing address at a commercial mailbox service on Magazine Street in New Orleans. Hamill had pulled the utility records for the mailbox service and cross-referenced them with the prepaid phone accounts used across all 5 network cities. 1 number appears in every city, Hamill said. Activated in Baton Rouge, used in Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, and Wilmington. The billing pattern shows it pings cellular towers within a 3-block radius of the French Quarter every Sunday between 8 and 11 a.m. Whoever carries this phone goes to the same neighborhood every Sunday morning. Church, brunch, or a standing meeting. Anders Cross, I said. Anders Cross. Scandinavian male, consistent with the paternal DNA markers from Elise's test. If this is the same man, he's not just the financial architect. He's the biological center of the network. Renata pulled a photograph from her folder and placed it on the table. It was a surveillance image captured by a traffic camera on Royal Street in New Orleans, a tall, lean man with pale blonde hair and a gray overcoat walking past a wrought iron balcony. The timestamp was 3 Sundays ago. The image was grainy but clear enough to show his face in profile. Sharp jaw, deep-set eyes. The kind of bone structure that looks carved rather than grown. This is the only confirmed image we have, Renata said. I sent it to the FBI's New Orleans field office yesterday, along with our full evidence package, the confession recording, the financial forensics, the DNA results, the maze connection, and the arson pattern analysis. Agent Catherine Vance is the lead. She called me back within 2 hours. And she wants to move. The Bureau has been building a RICO case against the network, but lacked the connective tissue between cities. Our evidence provides it. Margot's confession ties Charleston to the Central Fund. Hamill's financial trace ties the fund to Cross Capital Partners. The DNA ties Cross to Margot personally. Agent Vance is requesting simultaneous raid warrants for all 5 cities. The room was silent for a moment. Buddy tapped his pencil against the legal pad 3 times, a habit I recognized from childhood. The rhythm he uses when he is calculating consequences. Timeline? Buddy asked. Vance wants 72 hours to coordinate with field offices in Savannah, Jacksonville, Baton Rouge, and Wilmington. Simultaneous execution prevents the network from warning each other. She's targeting Wednesday morning, 6 a.m., all 5 locations. And Margot? Margot is the Charleston target. FBI and ATF Joint Operation ATF, because of the arson connections. They'll execute at the house on Lagar Street. My house. The house where Lucille was currently making breakfast. The house where Elise was sleeping in her crib, with her arms above her head. The house where Margot was living as my daughter-in-law, drinking coffee from the mug she had custom-ordered for my wife, watering the hydrangeas she had planted in my garden. I need to tell Lucille, I said. You need to tell Lucille to be somewhere else on Wednesday morning. Renata said. Take her to breakfast. Leave the house by 5:30. The team will be in position by 5:45. And Elise? This was the question that silenced every other calculation in the room. A 2-year-old child in a house during a federal raid. Flashbang grenades and body armor and shouted commands. The mathematics of tactical entry do not account for a child's terror. Agent Vance has assigned a child extraction specialist to the Charleston team, Renata said. A female agent trained in infant recovery during high-risk operations. She will enter the residence 30 seconds after the initial breach, locate Elise, and remove her to a secure vehicle. Davis will be waiting in that vehicle, with a family court-appointed guardian ad litem. Buddy has already filed the emergency motion. Filed it this morning, Buddy confirmed. Judge Marsh will review it Monday. Given the criminal evidence, I expect she'll grant Davis temporary emergency custody, effective upon Margot's arrest. The TRO dissolves automatically when the petitioner is taken into federal custody. I looked at the map on the wall. 5 red pins. 5 cities. 5 families. Destroyed by the same machine. I looked at the surveillance photo of Anders Cross walking down Royal Street in his gray overcoat, and I thought about a 2-year-old girl with gold hair who called my son Daddy. There's one more thing I need to do before Wednesday, I said. What? Renata asked. I need to look Margot in the eye. One time. Not as an investigator. Not as a victim. As the father of the man she tried to destroy. Renata started to object. Buddy raised his hand, a courtroom gesture that meant, let him speak. I'm not going to tip her off, I said. I'm not going to threaten her or confront her with evidence. I'm going to sit across from her at my own kitchen table and ask her one question, and I'm going to watch her answer it. What question? Buddy asked. I'm going to ask her if she loves my son. The room held its breath. Then Buddy nodded once, the slow nod of a man who understands that some things must be done not because they serve the case, but because they serve the soul. Make it Sunday, he said. Before church. And keep it under 3 minutes. Sunday morning I found Margot alone in the kitchen at 6:40. Lucille had taken Elise to the garden to see the cardinals, a routine. Buddy and I arranged so the house would be quiet. Margot was making coffee. French press. Exactly 4 minutes steep. Barefoot on hardwood, wearing one of Davis's old Citadel t-shirts, hair pulled back in a loose knot. She looked like someone's wife. She looked like every lie she had ever told compressed into a single morning. Good morning, Dad, she said. I sat at the table. She poured me a cup without asking and set it on the placemat with a napkin folded into a triangle, a small gesture of care that cost her nothing and meant less. I want to ask you something, I said. She sat across from me, hands resting on the table, with palms slightly upward. A body language technique from undercover training manuals. It communicates vulnerability. It invites trust. Do you love my son? The kitchen went still. Outside, Elise laughed at something in the garden, bright, uncomplicated. The laughter of a child who does not know the world contains people who build families the way architects build facades. Margot looked at me for 3 seconds. I love Davis more than you will ever understand, she said. She did not blink. Her voice carried a warmth so authentic that without 6 days of evidence, I would have believed her. And that was the answer, not the words, but the performance. A woman who loves someone stumbles over the declaration, She qualifies it. She shows the mess of it. Margot's was flawless, and flawlessness is the fingerprint of fabrication. Thank you, I said. 2 minutes and 14 seconds, under Buddy's limit. I walked out and did not look back. Wednesday, 5:17 a.m. The sky over Charleston was the color of wet slate. Lucille and I sat at Poogan's porch on Queen Street, 3 miles from the house on Lagar. She was eating a biscuit with honey and reading obituaries in the Post and Courier, her morning ritual, scanning for names she recognized, stories that remind the living not to waste time. She knew the timeline. 3 days earlier, she had packed a bag for Elise and hidden it in Davis's trunk diapers, a change of clothes, the stuffed rabbit, a sippy cup, and a photograph of Davis holding Elise at the beach. She did this at 4 a.m. while I pretended to sleep. My prepaid phone buzzed at 5:45. Renata. Teams in position. All 5 cities. Green light confirmed. At 5:58. Breach in 2 minutes. I looked at Lucille. She put her hand over mine. 31 years of marriage. And I had never needed her hand more. I was not there. But Renata described it with the precision of a woman who knows details matter more than drama. The FBI tactical team arrived at Laguerre Street in 3 unmarked vehicles. 8 agents in body armor, 2 ATF specialists, and the child extraction agent Sergeant Dana Holloway, who had performed infant recoveries in 11 previous operations. They staged behind the garden wall, out of sight. At 600 hours, the commander signaled. 2 agents breached the front door with a hydraulic ram, a single thunderclap that divides time into before and after. 2 more entered through the garden. Flashbang deployed in the front hallway, not the bedroom, not the nursery calculated placement to disorient without proximity to the child. Margot was in the master bedroom, already standing beside the bed, hands raised. She had been awake, the habit of someone who always knew this moment would come. She said one sentence. The child is in the next room. Professional to the end. Holloway entered the nursery 31 seconds after breach. Elise was standing in her crib, crying, not panicked, shrieking, but the confused, hitching cry of a child pulled from sleep by a sound she could not understand. Holloway wrapped her in the crib blanket and carried her through the back garden to the secure vehicle on the adjacent street. Davis was in that vehicle. He had been sitting there since 5:30, alone in the dark, holding the stuffed rabbit. When Holloway placed Elise in his arms, he did not speak. He pressed his face into her hair and held her against his chest. Holloway told Renata later that in 11 operations, she had never seen a father hold a child that tightly without the child protesting. Elise did not protest. She put her small hand on Davis's cheek and said Dada. Margot was handcuffed in the front hallway. Agents recovered 2 laptops, 4 prepaid phones, a portable hard drive, $9,000 in cash, and a leather portfolio containing custodial agreements for 3 families in 3 states, each awaiting signature, each structured to transfer assets into the Heritage Fund. She had been preparing new targets while living under my roof. In Savannah, agents arrested Carla Denning, who had operated under the Julian Cross brand for 3 years. In Jacksonville, Thomas Fleet was taken at a marina. In Wilmington, Sandra Voss was arrested at a vacation rental. And in New Orleans, at 7 minutes past 6 Central Time, FBI agents entered a townhouse on Dumaine Street in the French Quarter and arrested Anders Cross. He was sitting at a breakfast table reading a newspaper, wearing a gray overcoat. He did not resist. 5 cities. 5 operatives. 1 network. Dismantled in 17 minutes. Renata called at 6:22. It's done. All targets in custody. Elise is with Davis. I put the phone down. Lucille was still holding my hand. Her biscuit was untouched. Her eyes wet. Outside, the first rain was falling on Queen Street, washing the sidewalks the way Charleston rain always does, gently, persistently, as if the city understood that some things need rinsing away before the day can begin. Let's go get our granddaughter, she said. The Charleston County Family Courthouse sits on Broad Street, 4 blocks from the Blind Tiger where Davis had recorded Margot's confession 11 days earlier. Limestone columns, polished floors. The kind of institutional symmetry that suggests fairness is built into the architecture. I have spent enough time in courtrooms to know fairness is never built in. It is argued for, document by document. And sometimes it arrives, and sometimes it does not. Monday, 9 a.m. Courtroom 3B. Judge Evelyn Marsh presiding. Davis sat at the petitioner's table with Uncle Buddy, wearing a navy suit Lucille had pressed the night before. He had shaved for the first time in a week, and a small nick on his jaw was still covered with a piece of tissue he had forgotten to remove. Lucille sat in the first row, hands folded, wearing the expression she had worn in the kitchen when she told me to tell her everything composed, alert, prepared to absorb whatever came next. Catherine Rames sat at the respondent's table alone. Her client was in federal custody at the Charleston County Detention Center, denied bail by a magistrate, who concluded that a woman with 4 confirmed aliases and no verified identity was unlikely to appear for future proceedings. The respondent's chair was empty, and its emptiness said more than any testimony could. Buddy stood first. Seersucker suit, gravel and honey voice, that filled the room without rising above conversational volume. Your Honor, the petitioner, Davis Beaumont, is the only father this child has ever known. He was present at her birth, is listed on the birth certificate, and has been her primary caregiver for every day of her 26 months. He has attended every pediatric appointment, enrolled her in daycare, and is the person she calls when she wakes in the night. He placed a folder on the bench: medical records, daycare enrollment, pediatrician testimony, a signed statement from Elise's teacher confirming Davis dropped off and picked up the child every day without exception. The respondent has been operating under the stolen identity of Margot Ann Langley, declared presumed deceased in 2017 following Hurricane Matthew. She is in federal custody facing charges of wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit arson. Her true identity remains unverified. She cannot demonstrate legal standing to claim custody under a name that does not belong to her. Rames stood. Composed, professional, operating under constraints she had not anticipated when she accepted the retainer. Your Honor, my client is the biological mother. Biological parentage establishes standing under South Carolina family law. The criminal charges are allegations, not convictions. Counselor, Marsh interrupted. Your client filed for a restraining order under the name Margot Ann Langley. If that identity is fraudulent, the filings themselves are defective. You cannot petition this court under a stolen name. Silence. Rames regrouped with the precision of an attorney who knows a position is collapsing. I request a continuance to allow my client to establish her legal identity. Denied. The child's welfare does not pause for administrative convenience. Marsh turned to Buddy. Present your psychological parent argument. Buddy placed a second folder on the bench. South Carolina recognizes that a psychological parent, an individual who has fulfilled day-to-day responsibilities and formed a bonded relationship with the child, has standing equal to or exceeding a biological parent who has not served in that role. Davis Beaumont meets every criterion in Middleton v. Johnson, 2011. He opened the folder, DNA results, the confession recording transcript, certified by a court reporter, Hamill's financial forensic analysis, Renata's investigative report documenting stolen identity, arson connections, and Heritage Fund architecture. Each document tabbed, indexed, cross-referenced 43 years of practice compressed into a single package that left no gap for doubt. The DNA confirms Davis is not the biological father. The biological father, Anders Cross, is in federal custody in New Orleans, on RICO charges. The biological mother is in federal custody here. Neither biological parent is available, fit, or legally positioned to provide care. Davis Beaumont is not only the psychological parent, He is the only parent this child has. Marsh reviewed the documents for 7 minutes. Davis sat with his hands flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread. The posture I taught him as a boy. Feel the surface beneath you. Let the solid thing hold you up. Marsh looked up. The court grants emergency temporary custody of Elise Beaumont to Davis Beaumont, effective immediately. The restraining order filed under Case 2024FC07734 is dissolved. A full custody hearing will be scheduled within 60 days. Until that hearing, Davis Beaumont shall have sole physical and legal custody. The gavel struck once. Small and sharp, like a door closing. Davis sat still for 3 seconds, palms flat, confirming the surface was real. Then he turned to Lucille. She was crying silently, tears running unhurried down her face, the tears of someone who held them too long and could no longer justify the effort. Buddy placed his hand on Davis's shoulder. She's yours. Legally. Permanently. Yours. Davis walked to his mother, knelt beside her seat, and put his head against her shoulder. Lucille placed her hand on the back of his neck, the way she had when he was 7 and frightened of storms. I stood at the back of the courtroom and watched without approaching, because some moments belong only to the people inside them. Rames passed me in the hallway without speaking. She walked with the brisk efficiency of an attorney already calculating her next motion, her next attempt to reconstruct a case built on sand and signed with a dead woman's name. Renata was waiting on the courthouse steps. Federal arraignment Thursday. Margot and Cross charged under the same RICO indictment, 11 counts wire fraud, 7 identity theft, 4 arson conspiracy, 1 insurance fraud conspiracy. Sentencing guidelines: 18 to 22 years. The other operatives? Fleet in Jacksonville flipped within 6 hours, providing testimony on the financial architecture. The network is unraveling from the edges inward. I looked down Broad Street toward the harbor. The same street, the same light, the same city that had watched me raise a son and fight for a granddaughter in the space of 2 weeks. Charleston does not change. It absorbs your story into its collection and keeps standing. Thursday, I said. I'll be there. The federal courthouse in Charleston occupies a limestone building on Meeting Street that was constructed in 1896 and has witnessed every category of human failure the law can name: drug trafficking, tax evasion, public corruption, murder for hire. Its corridors smell of floor wax and old paper, and the courtrooms have the high ceilings and heavy oak furniture of an era that believed justice required a certain weight of wood to feel legitimate. I had testified in this building 11 times during my career. I had never entered it as a victim. Thursday, 2 p.m. Courtroom 1. The federal arraignment was a procedural formality. Charges read, pleas entered, bail arguments presented and denied. But it was also the first time I saw Margot since the raid. She was brought in through the side door in an orange jumpsuit and wrist restraints, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. Her hair was pulled back in a plain ponytail. No makeup, no white sundress, no farmer's market tote bag. She looked smaller than I remembered. The way buildings look smaller after a fire has taken the roof, the structure is still there, but the thing that gave it height is gone. She did not look at me. She did not look at Davis, who sat 3 rows behind me with Buddy. She looked straight ahead at the bench, with the focused blankness of a woman who had already begun calculating her next architecture, even from inside a cage. Anders Cross was arraigned separately, 30 minutes later, via video link from the federal detention facility in New Orleans. I saw his face clearly for the first time, not the grainy traffic camera profile from Royal Street, but a full-frame image on the courtroom monitor. High cheekbones, pale blue eyes, blonde hair cut short. He was 41 years old and looked like a man who had never raised his voice in his life. He stated his name in a flat Midwestern accent that carried no trace of Scandinavian origin, and entered a plea of not guilty with the mechanical calm of someone reciting a script he had memorized long before he needed it. The RICO indictment was read in full. 11 counts of wire fraud, 7 counts of identity theft, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit arson, 1 count of conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, 1 count of obstruction of justice, the Deputy Mays payoff. The total alleged losses across 5 states, $4.7 million. Revised upward from Renata's earlier estimate after Fleet's cooperation uncovered additional victims in Baton Rouge. Margot's attorney, a federal public defender now, not Catherine Rames, who had withdrawn from the case after the custody ruling, entered a plea of not guilty. Bail was denied for both defendants. Trial was set for September, but September never came. 6 weeks after the arraignment, Renata called me at 7 in the morning. "She's pleading," she said. Margot's counsel negotiated a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office, full disclosure of the network's financial structure, identification of all operatives, testimony against Cross. In exchange, the arson conspiracy charges are dropped and the sentencing recommendation is reduced. To what? 12 years. Federal facility. Eligible for parole in 8 years. Elise would be 10 when the woman who gave birth to her first became eligible to walk free. Old enough to ask questions, old enough to understand answers, old enough to be hurt by them. And Cross rejected every deal. His attorneys filed a motion to suppress the DNA evidence on Fourth Amendment grounds. The motion was denied yesterday. Without a plea agreement, he goes to trial on all counts. The prosecution is confident. Fleet's testimony alone is enough for conviction on the wire fraud charges, and the financial forensics tie him to every node in the network. The sentencing hearing for Margot took place on a Tuesday in August, 3 months after the raid. The courtroom was fuller this time. Eugene Thibodeau had driven up from Savannah, 73 years old, wearing a Marine Corps tie clip and a suit jacket that hung loose on a frame that had lost weight since I first heard his name. He sat in the gallery with his hands on his knees and watched Margot enter the courtroom with the expression of a man seeing the face of the person who had burned his house and, with it, every photograph of his late wife he had not thought to digitize. 3 other victims were present. A couple from Jacksonville, retired teachers whose pension had been routed through the Heritage Fund, and a woman from Wilmington whose historic home had been destroyed in what investigators now confirmed was a network-orchestrated arson. They sat quietly, the way victims sit in courtrooms, not with anger, but with the particular stillness of people who have learned that the legal system processes grief at its own speed and does not accelerate for anyone. The judge invited victim impact statements. Eugene stood first. He walked to the podium with the careful posture of a man whose knees had carried him through 30 years of military service and were now carrying him through something harder. "I am 73 years old," he said. "I served this country for 30 years. I came home and built a life in a house my grandfather built. That house survived 2 hurricanes and 100 years of Savannah heat. It did not survive you." He looked directly at Margot. She did not look away. I will give her that. She received his gaze the way a wall receives rain. "You sat in my kitchen," Eugene continued. "You remembered my birthday. You called me, sir. And while you were doing that, you were measuring my house for the match. I don't want your apology. An apology from someone who doesn't exist isn't worth the air it uses. I want you to hear my name. Eugene Thibodeau. Remember it. Because I will be at every parole hearing for the rest of my natural life." He returned to his seat. The courtroom was silent. The judge made a note. Margot's counsel presented mitigation. Difficult childhood. Trafficking victim at 19, recruited into the network under duress. Some of it may have been true. The machinery of exploitation does not discriminate. And it is possible to be both a victim and an architect of victimization. The judge listened with the patience of a man who has heard every version of this argument and has learned to weigh it without being moved by it. The sentence was handed down at 3:47 p.m. 12 years federal imprisonment. 5 years supervised release. Full restitution of $4.7 million, a number that would follow her for the rest of her life, accruing interest, attached to every asset she would ever hold. She was ordered to surrender all claims to the minor child, Elise Beaumont, and prohibited from initiating contact with any member of the Beaumont family for the duration of her sentence and supervised release. Margot stood for sentencing with her hands clasped in front of her. When the judge finished, she nodded once, a small, precise movement that contained no visible emotion. Then she was led out through the side door, and the courtroom absorbed her absence the way courtrooms always do, with a settling of air and a shuffling of papers, and the quiet understanding that the space she occupied would be filled by someone else's case within the hour. Davis and I walked out together. The August heat hit us on the courthouse steps like a wall, and the palmetto trees along Meeting Street cast shadows that looked like open hands on the sidewalk. 12 years, Davis said. 12 years. Is it enough? I thought about Eugene Thibodeau's house, about the 3 Charleston families, about the teachers in Jacksonville, and the woman in Wilmington, about Lucille's pearls and my father's charts and the fingerprints harvested from a Christmas mirror, about a 2-year-old girl who said Dada in the back of a dark vehicle while flashbang echoes faded in the morning rain. No sentence is enough, I said. But it's what the law can do. The rest is ours. 3 months after the sentencing, Davis adopted Elise. The paperwork had moved through the family court with the unhurried precision of a system that does not care about urgency, but responds to completeness. Uncle Buddy had filed the petition the week after Margot's sentencing, supported by the permanent custody order Judge Marsh had issued, following a full evidentiary hearing in which no one appeared to contest. The biological mother had surrendered all parental rights as a condition of her plea. The biological father was awaiting trial in a federal facility in Louisiana and had made no claim to the child. His attorneys had advised him correctly that asserting paternity would add a human trafficking enhancement to his RICO charges, since the network's practice of fathering children with operatives for the purpose of infiltrating target families met the federal definition of exploitation. The adoption was finalized on a Friday afternoon in October. Judge Marsh signed the order in chambers, not in open court, a courtesy she extended, I believe, because she had watched this family endure enough public proceedings to last a lifetime. Davis held Elise on his hip while the judge signed. Elise was wearing a yellow dress Lucille had bought for the occasion, and was more interested in the judge's gavel than in the document that was rewriting her legal identity. She reached for it twice. Marsh smiled and let her hold it. "Congratulations, Mr. Beaumont," Marsh said. "She's yours." Buddy had said the same words 3 months earlier, in a different courtroom, under different circumstances. But repetition did not diminish them. Some sentences gain weight each time they are spoken, the way rivers gain force each time they pass through a narrow channel. She's yours. 2 words that contain 26 months of midnight feedings and pediatric emergencies and lullabies sung off-key in a dark room, and now they also contain the full authority of the state of South Carolina. That evening, Lucille cooked. She had been planning the dinner for 2 weeks, not with lists or recipes, but with the slow, instinctive preparation of a woman who expresses love through the geometry of a kitchen. She made shrimp and grits with tasso ham, collard greens with pot liquor, cornbread in the cast-iron skillet her mother had seasoned for 40 years, and a coconut cake with 7-minute frosting that she started at 6 a.m. and finished at 4 p.m. because she refuses to use any recipe that does not require patience. The table was set for 7. Hank and Lucille at the heads, Davis and Elise. On one side, Elise in the high chair. Davis had built himself from reclaimed cypress, sanded smooth and sealed with food-safe oil because he is an architect and cannot help constructing things for the people he loves. Uncle Buddy on the other side, next to Renata Voss, who had accepted the invitation with the bemused caution of a woman unaccustomed to eating dinner with the families of her cases. Stephen Hamill had been invited but was in Nassau, tracing the final threads of the Heritage Fund's offshore accounts for the federal prosecutor. The 7th place was for Eugene Thibodeau, who had driven up from Savannah that morning in a rented sedan because his own car had been sold months ago to cover legal expenses. He arrived at 5:30 carrying a bottle of muscadine wine from a vineyard on Edisto Island and wearing the Marine Corps tie clip that had become his courtroom uniform. He shook my hand on the porch with the grip of a man who has learned to hold on to things carefully because he knows what it costs to let them go. "Your home is beautiful," he said, looking up at the facade. The same facade Margot had measured for insurance value. The same ironwork my great-grandfather had installed. The same slate roof that had sheltered 4 generations of Beaumonts through hurricanes and wars and now, through this. "It's still standing," I said. "That's what matters." We ate. The conversation moved the way Southern dinner conversation moves in slow circles, touching lightly on weather and football, and the condition of the harbor shrimp this season, before settling into the quieter waters that everyone had come to navigate. Buddy told a story about a custody case from 1987 that involved a parrot as a material witness. Renata described the forensic accounting process with a dryness that made Buddy laugh so hard he had to set down his fork. Eugene talked about his house, not the one that burned, but the new apartment in Savannah, where he was learning to live with less and finding, to his surprise, that less was not the same as empty. Elise ate cornbread with both fists and dropped collard greens on the floor with the systematic determination of a child conducting an experiment in gravity. Davis wiped her face with a napkin and cut her shrimp into pieces so small they were almost theoretical. And every few minutes he looked at her with an expression that I recognized, because I had worn it myself 32 years ago. The bewildered gratitude of a man who cannot believe he has been trusted with something this important. Lucille watched all of this from her end of the table, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had spent 3 months smiling at the person who robbed her and had earned the right to smile at the people who remained. She had not replaced the stolen jewelry. She had not asked about recovery or restitution. When I told her that Hamill had traced the Akoya pearls to a dealer in Atlanta and that they could be recovered, she shook her head. "Let them go," she said. "They're just things. This is not." After dinner, I took Eugene onto the back porch. The October air was cool for Charleston, carrying the first hints of the season that passes for autumn in the Low Country. A slight sharpening of the salt breeze. A darkening of the marsh grass from green to gold. We sat in the rocking chairs and watched the garden where Margot's hydrangeas were still blooming, because plants do not know who planted them and bloom regardless. "I want to show you something," I said. I handed him a folder. Inside was a letter from the Federal Asset Recovery Office, confirming that $87,000 of the seized funds had been allocated to Eugene Thibodeau as partial restitution. It was not enough to rebuild his house. It was not enough to replace the photographs. But it was enough to know that the system, slow and imperfect as it is, had not forgotten his name. Eugene read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket beside the Marine Corps tie clip. "Your boy," he said, nodding toward the kitchen where Davis was washing dishes with Elise on his hip, her head resting against his shoulder, her eyes half closed. "He's a good father." "He is. That little girl doesn't know how lucky she is. She'll know. Someday." Eugene rocked in his chair and looked out at the garden. "You know what I miss most about my house? Not the furniture. Not the photographs. I miss the way the floorboards sounded in the morning when I walked to the kitchen. Every house has its own sound. You can't replace that. I listened to the floorboards beneath my own rocking chair, the creak of heart pine laid in 1923, carrying the accumulated weight of a century of footsteps. He was right. You cannot replace it. You can only protect it while you are able, and grieve it honestly when you cannot. "You're welcome here any time, Eugene," I said. He nodded. We rocked in silence for a long time, 2 old men on a porch watching the dark settle over a garden that did not know its history, listening to the sounds of a family putting itself back together one washed dish at a time. On the 6th of January, Anders Cross was convicted on all counts. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. Fleet's testimony dismantled the financial architecture with the precision of a man who helped build it. Hamill's forensic analysis provided the mathematical proof account numbers, routing sequences, timestamps placing cross at the center of every transaction across 5 states. The DNA evidence, fought through 4 suppression motions, was admitted in full. The jury deliberated 6 hours. Guilty on all 26 counts. Sentencing guidelines: 22 to 27 years, no parole under federal statute. Anders Cross would be 63 before he saw the outside of a prison. By then, Elise would be a grown woman with a life he had no part in building. I watched the verdict on a live stream from my study. Davis was beside me. Elise asleep on his lap, thumb in her mouth, head tucked into his elbow. When the foreperson said guilty for the 26th time, Davis exhaled and looked down at his daughter. "It's over," he said. "The trial is over. The rest is just beginning." 2 weeks later, I drove to the Charleston Museum on Meeting Street. Dr. Helen Caraway, Director of Collections, had been trying to acquire the 1,742 Middleton Coastal Survey for 11 years. I handed her the case. She opened it and looked at the chart hand-ink soundings of the Cooper River mouth, faded iron gall notations, brittle edges that had survived 282 years of salt air and, most recently, the attention of a woman who planned to convert it into collateral for a fund that did not exist. "Are you certain?" she asked. "I've held on to it for 30 years. It's time it belonged to everyone."